When it comes to genre fiction, mystery has perpetually sat in a uniquely unenviable position for writers, regardless of medium, for about as long as we've had the concept of a mystery story. Every genre struggles with its own obstacles, to be clear. A romance story has to find a way to convincingly portray romantic tension and develop a relationship in a way that feels authentic and enticing. A horror story has to be able to invoke dread and fear to the audience in a way that's compelling and visceral. A science fiction story has to work around the hard limits set by the technology that the narrative revolves around and find a way to explain that to the audience without becoming tedious. A fantasy story typically has to do the same thing, but just with magic, and so on and so forth. These are all genuinely really difficult, and I want to make it clear that none of what I'm trying to say is trying to downplay that. Mystery isn't unique for its ability to make writers struggle. Everything makes writers struggle. Rather, it is the specific nature of the struggle that's unique. Puzzles. Where romance revolves around love and relationships, and horror revolves around fear and terror, and sci-fi revolves around technology and futurism, and fantasy revolves around magic and the mythical, mystery revolves around puzzles. And puzzles pose a unique challenge for writers. Not only do you have to create a puzzle that your audience will want to see solved, but you also have to construct a narrative around that puzzle that makes it engaging and exciting to watch the characters put the pieces together. You have to find the sweet spot between telling them too much information too early and too little information too late. And you have to make sure that all the pieces you've given the audience can actually be assembled to put together the picture you're presenting them with. Writing a mystery requires a lot of logistical planning of timing and positioning for both characters and items, but also a lot of sleight of hand surrounding how you communicate that to the audience without giving too much away. You have to make sure your audience doesn't solve the puzzle too early, but also that they're capable of putting the pieces together, at least enough of it together, for themselves that they don't feel blindsided by the conclusion. You need to move fast enough to keep it engaging, but slow enough that you don't rush past important details. That is really hard to get right, but when it lands, it fucking kills. A good mystery keeps you on the edge of your seat to the very end as you try and guess who did it, where, and with what. And the feeling of it all coming together as you watch the characters put the final pieces into place, or maybe even the culprit showing how they did it once they're confident they've gotten away with it, it hits like fucking crack. There is a reason why good mystery narratives tend to linger in the cultural consciousness for so long compared to their contemporaries, whether it's like Knives Out, or Sherlock Holmes, or And Then There Were None, or even the 1985 Clue movie. A good mystery not only tells a great story, but allows for unique kinds of characters and motivations and behaviors that just don't always have a ton of space in other narratives. What's more, it requires the audience to actually try and solve the problem alongside the characters in a way that isn't typically part of the experience of consuming media. You're expected to be engaging with the mystery as a puzzle and trying to solve it yourself, not just watching characters do something on screen. A good mystery will not only have the characters trying to figure out who done it, but the audience too. Can they figure it out before the killer is revealed? If so, was it too easy? And if not, was it too hard? And this is all just discussing non-interactive mysteries. Movies, books, TV shows, and the like. At least when it's non-interactive, you still have control of the pacing, the actions of the characters, the perspective of the audience, and the order of events, plus everything else. Video games, by contrast, have basically none of that, and it makes it really hard for mysteries to work in the medium. We've talked a bunch of times on this channel about how basically every aspect of narrative storytelling and world building becomes harder in video games, but the mystery genre is maybe the area where that difficulty spike is largest, and it was already a uniquely challenging genre to begin with. Video games introduce a ton of unpredictability that can make it really, really difficult to make it all work. So today, I want to try and solve the mystery of why specifically video games struggle to get mysteries right. Part 1. We're all kind of stupid. So, the obvious place to start with is the fact that the average person is pretty dumb. If you've ever worked a customer service job, especially one with just any degree of technical or specialized skill, you will know that the average person cannot be trusted to problem solve on their own. And that's just the average person. You gotta remember that 50% of people are dumber than that person. Whenever you're telling a mystery story in any medium, you have a few questions to ask yourself related to this. What level of intelligence are you assuming in your audience? Are you intending for your audience to be able to solve the mystery? And how are you going to tailor the story to match those answers? For example, Blue's Clues is, at its core, a serialized mystery narrative for children where the goal is for the audience to be able to solve the mystery by the end of the episode. The host will walk them through the process at the conclusion to try and teach them how to follow a train of logic, and the story of an episode is based around finding Blue's 3 clues, putting them together, and then doing whatever it was she was trying to communicate. Hoodwinked is also mostly for children, but a little bit older, and they're not really trying to make it so that a child could solve it on the first watch. An adult could probably pretty easily put it together if they were actually trying to, but the target audience is expected to watch it once, learn the truth of the case, and then be able to see all the clues when they go back and watch it again. And the story is told through the format of a police procedural with overlapping narratives in a way that discombobulates the audience and forces them to sort through 4 separate retellings of the events to figure out who the goody bandit is. The 1985 Clue movie expects you to be an adult of at least average intelligence who's paying active attention, especially because its gimmick of 3 equally viable endings relies on you paying enough attention to notice the moments where it could have been one person, but also could have been someone else. In theory, it's a solvable case, but in practice, the goal of the story was to get you to rewatch and try and find all the little clues that they reveal in each of the endings. Part of what makes Clue so good is seeing how they manage to tailor the story for this, building in alibis that both do and don't hold up depending on the ending, and where it somehow manages to feel earned no matter how they go. However, in all three of these examples, they rely on you not having interactable control over the experience. The host of Blue's Clues doesn't give a shit if the kid doesn't correctly answer the call and response. He'll say the correct answer and move on regardless. Clue and Hoodwinked both rely on being able to use very careful camera work to pull their tricks off, and if the audience could control where they were looking or move around within the scene or choose how and when to interact with the other characters, it would ruin 99% of what they're able to get away with. It's not to say it's impossible to tell a mystery story in a video game, to be clear. It's just that the conventional techniques used by the genre in any other visual medium often don't carry over to gaming because the gamers exist and are pushing buttons, so the strategies have to be updated. Mysteries as a genre generally rely on being able to keep the audience on rails, which is fine when you're working in a medium that doesn't really allow for anything else. But the audience for video games doesn't really like being put on rails that much. Or at least they don't want to be made to feel like they're on rails. So instead, you have to tell your story in a way that accommodates that player autonomy. And different games take different approaches to that. A lot of games will specify the time and date of given events right up until it's time for the player to meaningfully take control and have some options as to how to proceed, at which point it'll stop showing those details to allow them to be done in any order. If we extend the train analogy of being on rails, this approach is like that bit in the Polar Express where the train crosses the frozen lake, spinning out a bit before landing on the rails on the other side. The Somnium Files does this whenever you're investigating in the real world and need to visit a few locations to talk to different people, no longer giving you specifics about the time in order to accommodate you visiting them in whatever order you choose and spending however long you want there. The other common strategy is just to technically give the player autonomy in choosing what they do, but in practice keeping it pretty linear by only allowing things to actually progress once you do the thing the game wants you to do. In this analogy, it's like being told you have control over the route of the train and can choose how to turn at each split in the rails, but in reality, they all just lead you back to the same track the train company wants you to take. Ace Attorney games will allow you to do a million things wrong basically without consequence during the investigation phase, but it's not going to actually progress until you get it right in the way the game wants you to. By contrast, you have the game Shoot and Order, a game that is, at its core, a mystery game revolving around who murdered the founder, the head of the titular cult and nation-state. You play as that aforementioned founder, resurrected by God and given amnesia before being tasked with solving your own murder, while also using God to hack robots and explode people. Shoot and Order's gimmick is that each of the 5 suspects, your ministers of science, health, justice, education, and security, can be accused and investigated in any order, with each investigation being presented in the form of a different game genre. Science is a straightforward visual novel with multiple perspectives. Health is a zero-escape-esque escape game. Justice is more explicitly a mystery game along the lines of Danganronpa or Ace Attorney. Education is a dating sim of all things, and security is a stealth action game. Each route reveals different details about not only the world building, but the core mystery itself, and it's not until you finish all 5 that you're allowed to solve and figure out who done it. It's definitely an interesting approach, and I do think it's really cool that Shootin' tried to push the conventions of the mystery genre in this medium, but it does also really demonstrate why more games don't do this sort of thing. The results are definitely a bit mixed, and not every route is made equal, we'll say. And while I really enjoy the game, and I think it's a good one to play, there are definitely some points where you come away thinking like, yeah, so I get why this is the only game I've played that's tried to do this sort of thing. And all this stuff isn't bad, provided it's done right. Danganronpa is a good example of how you can hit some really high highs when you allow for autonomy of the audience, but also some very low lows when you have to operate within those constraints. The mystery genre at large has always had to learn how to hold its audience's hand through the puzzles, in spite of their wishes on account of the average person being kinda dumb, as mentioned earlier, and video games just changed the nature of the hand-holding. Like, you can see this in any medium, that's why the villain often explains how they did it all at the end. You want to make sure that even if you didn't pick up on everything, you understand that the pieces were there and that they do make sense. However, the mystery game that so many people who are watching this have probably been waiting to hear mentioned, given the thumbnail, is Disco Elysium. And that's a really interesting one in my opinion. At the core of Disco Elysium is the mission of solving a murder. The man has been lynched in the empty lot behind the hotel that Harry Dubois is staying in Revachol, and he's supposed to figure out who done it. As the story progresses, you learn that the victim is a mercenary who was hired by Wild Pines, a major company in the region, and their job was to help break a strike. And you depart on a journey of connecting with communists, fascists, capitalists, and cowards to try and figure out not just who the killer is, but kind of who you are as well. Disco Elysium does a lot of things really, really well, but when it comes to forming a mystery, one of the biggest shortcuts it takes is that it's not a live crime scene. A game like Danganronpa is uniquely disadvantaged by the fact that you're there before, during, and after the crime itself, which means that a lot of delicate care has to be taken to make sure that the balancing act of the mystery can be maintained. Disco Elysium still has live elements to the crime going on, and it is an evolving situation for sure, but the core mystery is exclusively presented retroactively. A live mystery is a challenge because your audience expects to be able to use their own first-hand experiences to solve the case, which is a lot harder to coordinate because you can't control what every individual's takeaway from a given scene or line or expression or whatever else will be. When it's not live, you instead have to shift to collecting secondhand evidence and witness testimony, which is Definitely still challenging, but is a lot easier to pull off in a video game scenario where the audience has some autonomy. Harry Dubois can wander off for a bit and discovers homosexual communard tendencies if he wants, but Makoto Naegi needs to be in the right place at the right time to discover a body and witness a particular incident as it's playing out. And what's more, you've really got to be able to rely on your audience's intelligence when it comes to putting the pieces together. And not in some you need a really high IQ to understand Rick and Morty type of thing. You just need to be able to expect them to be able to put things together logically. Doesn't mean you're holding them to a high standard, but you have to have a standard and you have to be able to expect them to meet it. Disco Elysium assumes that you will not only be able to read the words on the screen, but read between the lines too. And it uses its unique TTRPG style conversation system to help guide you along. For people who haven't played the game, Harry is suffering from basically just fermenting his brain in pure ethanol, and so now his own abilities will speak to him, interjecting their own opinions into the discussion. It's a really fun way to not only add a lot of flavor, but to offer some guidance as well, especially because the skills aren't always of the same mind when it comes to what you should do. Even when Disco Elysium offers you some guidance and holds your hand a bit, it expects you to be able to deduce what guidance is worth following and what they're really trying to guide you towards. Drama is not going to give you the same insights as perception when it comes to a conversation, because drama will skew towards a more dramatic outcome. As well, the story's narrative is open-ended enough that you can get to the solution in a few different ways depending on how you play it. If you're a moron, Kim Kitsuragi will call you a moron and there will be a moron route. Whatever your political sentiments are, the game will bend to make sure there's a way for the mystery to be solved within them. There are ways to permanently cut off some approaches. I mean, you can't do everything all the time, but unless you are just straight up not reading what the game is telling you, actively trying to sabotage your playthrough, or are genuinely just kind of too stupid for it, Disco Elysium is going to manage to guide you to the ending. And this isn't unique to Disco Elysium either. The 100-line Last Defense Academy does the same basic thing of accommodating the story to fit your choices, just to a much greater extent. But within the mystery genre, it is generally a pretty unique approach. Solving a mystery typically requires finding one singular correct answer, and that's pretty straightforward in non-interactive media. However, mysteries with multiple routes to the solution, or even multiple solutions, are rare. The 1985 Clue movie does this by setting everything up in such a way that there are 3 plausible, valid solutions to the mystery, but even then, that takes a lot of very precise camera work and logistical planning, and not all 3 endings are constructed equally. And when you can't solve the mystery yourself in a video game, it also just feels a lot more personally frustrating. Most people aren't going to feel personally robbed if they didn't figure out who killed Mr. Body before Wadsworth reveals it, but they will be annoyed if there was no way to solve a Danganronpa murder before the killer was revealed. It's honestly a testament to Disco Elysium storytelling that by the time it's all said and done, the killer is... How to put it without spoiling it more than necessary? Someone who feels like a pretty left field pick, I think we can all agree. It works because of the world building, not necessarily because it was super solvable or anything. Disco Elysium's approach of allowing for a pretty wide-ranging number of paths to the same answer isn't super unique either. Lots of mystery games try to do something similar. The problem is that typically there's one correct way to do it, and then a bunch of lesser, shittier ways to do it. After all, it's hard enough to write a good mystery when you only have to plan for one route. Having to allow for multiple routes to simultaneously coexist and be equally valid is a fucking logistical nightmare, especially because, again, people are just stupid. All that to say, one of the big challenges of writing a mystery for a video game is that the existing challenge for the genre of needing to accommodate the average audience member's intelligence is exacerbated by the lack of control the storyteller has over what you see, when you see it, and what your takeaway is. Writers have to decide how much they'll hold your hand and guide you to the answer that they're hoping you'll discover in a way that doesn't feel like they're taking your autonomy away as the player, or just handing you the answers. The more leash you give the player, the more noticeable it is when you yank it back and force them to stare at something you need them to notice. Whenever you lose control in a video game, it's mostly because the creators felt like what's coming next won't work unless they take the wheel back, and especially with a mystery, that can really risk giving the whole game away. But there's also another unique challenge here that plays off the audience's approach to video games. In particular, how it feels when you're the one solving the mystery, investigating clues, and, most importantly, having to talk to people. Part 2. The First-Person Liar. A universal truth of lying is that it is much easier to do it successfully when you are directly targeting a specific person, rather than just doing it in general, whether that's as a scammer or a criminal trying to convince you that they didn't do it. I have a whole video on this channel that demonstrates that targeting people with lies specifically is more effective at influencing outcomes than when you just give them a blanket lie. And in basically all my videos where the premise has been that I lied to people, the lies always seem pretty obvious to the audience watching, but basically nobody who's actually being lied to picks up on it until it's too late. Someone can look you in the eyes and say, "Trust me, I didn't do it," and our social impulses can make it hard to resist. It's a lot easier to identify a liar when we're just not the one being lied to. It's pretty easy for us to identify when someone else is being scammed. If you've ever had like a grandparent who tells you about the phone call they got from someone who demanded their debit card number, you know this. But that doesn't make it easier for us to avoid being scammed ourselves. And you'd be surprised how often the same people end up falling for that sort of thing when it's targeted at them. When it comes to writing fiction, whenever a character is lying, the writer must ask themselves, do I want the audience to know that this is a lie or not? They can communicate that it's a lie by showing the true information to the audience but not the victim of the lie, or they can have the liar give a look to the camera behind the victim's back, or make some other little gesture that indicates it's a lie, or have them have a conversation with another character revealing that it was a lie all along, or they can choose to keep it all hidden. For mystery stories, typically the goal is to never outright give away the lie, but to create ambiguity and confusion so the audience can start trying to build a case. However, where video games run into a unique challenge here is that, unlike any other medium, you, personally, are the one being directly lied to. And that changes the dynamic a lot. When it comes to lying in media, there's broadly 4 basic kinds of lies: character-to-character lies, character-to-audience lies, narrator-to-audience lies, and narrative-to-audience lies. I don't know if this is a real thing. This is my own bullshit, so if it's bullshit, then it's because I came up with something that's nonsense. Character-to-character is one character lying to another character via some sort of communication, like speech, gestures, or writing. Character-to-audience is a character in the narrative lying via some sort of external communication in a way that is meant to deceive the audience themselves, not just a character. Narrator-to-audience is the narrator of the story directly lying to the audience via internal communication that only exists in the meta-narrative but not necessarily the literal narrative itself. In other words, if not for our ability to peer into this character's mind, there would be no lie. It is a lie that exists only for the purposes of the narrative and only for our benefit as an audience member. Narrative to audience is when some part of the narrative structure itself is lying to the audience in a way that does not factor in any in-universe characters knowingly being part of the audience being deceived, either within the narrative itself or the meta-narrative. Each of these types of deception comes with challenges, and the nature of those challenges is pretty dramatically influenced by the medium. For example, in a book, character-to-character lying requires some very careful writing to communicate things like body language or tone, and getting that dialogue right is really hard. TV shows and movies tend to have an easier time with character-to-character lying because they have a lot of control over framing and visual communication to allow for more subtleties, but they also tend to struggle more with narrator-to-audience lying because typically that sort of media doesn't really do the sorts of internal monologues and narrators that enable that. Stage plays and musicals, by contrast, are excellent for handling instances of both character-to-audience lying and narrator-to-audience lying because the stage is really conducive to characters acting non-diegetically, i.e. doing things that we, the audience, can see but which aren't literally happening. Cell Block Tango isn't literally happening in the narrative of Chicago, but the characters are using it to, if not lie, then tell their versions of the story in a way they expect us, the audience, to believe. And given some of those characters, it's not a stretch to say that maybe they're not being 1,000% honest with us. Likewise, it's pretty common for a character to monologue directly to the audience to try and convince us of something in a way that rarely happens in any other medium because a fourth wall break just hits different on stage. Narrative to audience lying, though, is probably the hardest one to get away with in almost every medium. Not because it's necessarily uniquely hard to do or anything, but because it's frequently the most frustrating if not done right. After all, when you don't have the autonomy within the narrative, or when the narrative refuses to give you the autonomy to investigate it, it's not really fair for the narrative to betray the trust that you have to be able to place in it to some extent in order to function. The first trial of Danganronpa V3 is maybe the best example I can come up with of this sort of thing. It's not just characters lying to each other or to the audience, or even really the narrator lying to us as the audience. The narrator isn't trying to lie to us. We're being deceived by the narrative. The narrative structure itself is what lies to you in that case, and it's a big part of why it is so polarizing for a lot of people. Like, you don't really have a fair shot to solve it in a lot of cases because are you just supposed to operate under suspicion with the narrative at all times? Like, you have to be able to trust it to some extent, otherwise it's not worth consuming the media. Unreliable narrators are kind of a mix of this in the previous category since it's kind of the narrator lying to the audience, but it's being done with an assist from the narrative itself. And that sort of assist is pretty common across all kinds of lying in media. Sometimes the narrative is just straight up lying to the audience, again, like Danganronpa V3 first chapter, but more frequently the question here is basically how much the narrative will assist a liar, how much it'll tacitly endorse the liar's framing or emphasize the things that support the lie or hide the things that would disprove it or whatever else. However, this video is not just about the nature of mysteries, it's about why video games struggle to get them right. And in this case, a huge factor is that, unlike non-interactive media, it just hits different when you do have autonomy and are also being lied to. The dynamic is very, very tricky to nail, and it goes both ways. When we have autonomy, we expect to be able to perform competency. We expect that we should be able to do things to the level of competency that we think we could do them in the real world. And given that we all get a touch of the Dunning-Kruger every once in a while, we typically assume we'd be more competent than we actually are. Thus, not only do you need to account for how people will react to a lie that they've been told straight to their face compared to how they react to seeing it on a theater screen or reading it off a page, and not only do you need to make every lie as fair as it needs to be for the story's purposes, but you also need to make it feel fair. People don't like being lied to. Hot take, I know. And so if you're going to trick them, you need to come up with a way to do it that makes people feel like it was actually kind of earned. A pretty common reaction to a lie being revealed in a mystery game is just like, well, that was bullshit. How the fuck was I supposed to figure out that that was a lie? And that's a reaction that you're trying to avoid at all costs. Whether it is character to character, character to audience, narrator to audience, or anything else, it's trickier when you're in a context where you need the lie to stick for the narrative to progress, but also need the audience to be capable of figuring it out to eventually progress at a later point. It's a very fine line between, like, oh damn, I never saw that coming, and the fuck, how was I supposed to see that coming? And gaming will inevitably struggle with it more than most because it's just a lot easier to unintentionally make your audience feel stupid, which you generally want to avoid because they don't enjoy that feeling very much. Again, this is hard because most people are stupid. And to be clear, I'm not trying to exempt myself from this. If you've watched me play a mystery game, you have seen me be a fucking idiot. The Virtue's Last Reward VODs are still out there, and there are some puzzles that I did not do a good job of solving. We'll just say that. However, it's also hard because video games typically inherently require more narrative to audience lying than any other media, and those lies are the most fundamentally unsatisfying and unfair. We are limited by the abilities of the player character when it comes to perception, how they might poke holes in the narrative, and what truth the narrative will allow them to know. And every time the character doesn't pick up on something that the player does, the narrative is doing a little bit of that lying about what you did or didn't see, or what you could or couldn't put together for yourself. A good narrative to audience lie is one that you never really notice. A scenario in which you not only don't feel like you were robbed by the player character just not being allowed to say things they obviously should say, but where you don't feel like you were deliberately grabbed and pulled away from figuring out the truth in a way that you normally would have been able to. This is the sort of narrative to audience lie you see in a lot of non-interactive media. The camera panning away from the kitchen door in Clue when they find the cook's body in the freezer is the narrative effectively lying to you about what you would be able to perceive because it refuses to allow you to look back to the door to see who snuck out, even when the positioning of the characters would have all but guaranteed that they would have seen it happen. When you have autonomy, the lies have to account for that. You are lying in the first person, and likewise being lied to in the first person. Getting that right is just really, really hard, especially because even a minor hiccup can mess up the narrative flow. In non-interactive media, this is fine because there's no hiccup that isn't inherently part of that narrative, but in interactive media, a lie that's too good won't be figured out in time and the player will bash their head against possible solutions until they finally get it, at which point the narrative has to try and get its momentum back in a hurry. While, on the other hand, a lie that's too weak will make you feel frustrated that you should be allowed to act with autonomy and recognize the lie, but you're just not given the option. This actually brings me to a related point that I've touched on a little bit throughout this one, but really deserves its own section to fully get into. Part 3. Don't be suspicious. Or do. How do you communicate suspicion? Out of any emotion or state of existence, a state of suspicion or behaving suspiciously is arguably one of the hardest to correctly present in fiction because you need to be able to not only communicate a character feeling guilty or suspicious, but also how they feel about feeling guilty or suspicious and how they'll try and cover it up. What's more, this doesn't have any one right answer. Appropriately suspicious behavior for the audience will depend on how any individual character has been characterized so far based on, intelligence or social ability or emotionality and more. Plus, you've got to factor in cultural norms as well. Like, forgetting to take your shoes off when you walk into your house would be an indicator that you were either in a hurry and didn't have time or were too distracted to notice, but only if you live in a place where wearing your shoes indoors wasn't the norm. The trouble for video games is that the giveaways for suspicious behavior, a quick look off to the side or a second of fidgeting or a nervous breath or breaking eye contact, are almost always blink and you might miss it levels of subtle. And that's not the worst thing in the world in non-interactive visual media, it just means you have to pay attention. Where it becomes a struggle is when it's either non-visual or interactive. Namely, video games, audio, and literature. Drawing attention to suspicious behavior is difficult in any medium, but in film and television, you're allowed to leave clues more subtly in the background so people's wandering eyes might catch them. But when you don't have eyes on the scene, or you don't have control of where someone's eyes might be looking, you gotta get a bit more creative. In literature or audio, as discussed earlier, the advantage of not having a visual component is that the audience is a lot more primed to view the narration as not being inherently purely truthful. It is the perspective and opinion of the point of view character, and you're following their train of thought in a way that requires you to accept their framing, but not necessarily assume that you're getting the most pure, omniscient perspective that would allow you to guarantee certain facts. Most visual media would allow you to look around the scene and see who was or wasn't present, regardless of what the main character might be noticing, but in a book or a radio show or something like that, you recognize that you aren't inherently getting the full picture. You're only getting as much of the picture as the character is able to see and tell you about, and that can bridge the gap a little bit. In a video game, you tend to get the worst of both options. You are broadly limited to the perspective and opinion of the point of view character, like in a novel, but with a visual component and a degree of autonomy that can give you the room to come to your own conclusions and deduce more information, like in other media. This is a problem on all levels of mystery storytelling and gaming, but especially when it comes to communicating suspicion. It's so much harder to communicate suspicion, or a lack thereof, when you as the writer have to give up control over the camera, the pacing, and the conversations. Mysteries, more than any other genre, require a very carefully choreographed routine to play out in exactly the right way in order for them to work. And communicating suspicion requires it even more because it's often the aspect of the mystery that requires just the very finest of touches to get right. So, how do you handle it when there's some strange behavior that you want the audience to be suspicious of? Well, one big way to try and bridge the gap is for the game to be fully voiced. Voice acting and the nuances of tone, volume, and confidence can do a lot to help carry dialogue that otherwise might struggle to convey those hints of suspicion. There's a reason why no other medium on the planet conveys dialogue via a series of grunts and moans and generic phrases while the actual thing the characters are saying appears in a text bubble on the bottom of the screen. This is not the best for communicating emotion or tone. In fact, there's a lot of reasons why they don't, but pacing is a huge one for our purposes. It's hard to control for the pace of the conversation or the tone of the conversation when you're relying on the reading speed of your audience, which, if you've seen all the news out there, a lot of people just straight up can't fucking read. What's more, it also means that you can't use gestures or sound effects or animations that might be time sensitive in a way that would be maximally effective unless there is full voice acting, because you don't know if someone's going to make a big gesture with their hand until they get to that point, and if it's not voice acted, you don't know when they're going to get to that point. However, even when fully voiced, video game dialogue is uniquely stilted. Everyone in a video game tends to take their turn and wait for the player to press A to move on to the next sentence, which just makes it really hard to communicate characters interrupting one another or trying to quickly change the subject. What's more, one of the biggest challenges in communicating suspicion is that oftentimes the person acting suspicious is not an active participant in the current conversation. Now, two people might be talking and a third might be nervously shuffling in the background, but in a video game where conversation is turn-based, how do you subtly communicate that? For a lot of video game writers, the answer is what I call the ellipses of suspicion, where a writer, in order to communicate that a character is reacting nervously or suspiciously to something that's happened, will just cut to that character and give them a dialogue box that's just an ellipses. This is one of the least subtle ways possible to communicate suspicion, but it's also often somewhat unavoidable. Like, it's the dialogue equivalent of yellow paint, but in a lot of instances, what's the alternative? For one, again, a lot of people are genuinely kind of dumb and do legitimately need the yellow paint. But for another, it's not like there really is a better, more natural way to make it happen in a lot of games. Like I said, a lot of suspicion indicators are blink and you'll miss it levels of subtle, and given that video games generally try to avoid wrestling control of the camera away from the player in general, any effort to do so to try and catch those moments will inevitably stick out and ruin the subtlety of whatever indication you're trying to give them. However, there's also this much bigger picture issue around mysteries where you have to choreograph the events themselves in order to make the right people look the right amount of suspicious for the narrative beyond just dialogue. Where is everyone? When did they encounter each other? Where was the body and who could have found it first? Where and when is it possible for evidence to have been destroyed or hidden? This is easiest, as mentioned earlier, when you're not dealing with a live mystery, where you're trying to solve it after the fact rather than being present for the events you're trying to uncover. If the audience is present while a murder is happening, not necessarily even in the same room, but just like present in the environment at the time, then you'll have a much harder time threading the needle and inducing the right amount of suspicion at the right times. Clue is, again, an excellent example of this being done really well, which is, again, especially impressive given that there are 3 separate endings with different culprits, but again, it relies on not allowing the audience to have autonomy, particularly around character positioning and camera positioning. When the camera pans past the characters and subtly establishes someone either is or is not present during a moment where a murder might be occurring, or just showing someone nervously reacting to the rest of the cast deducing some truth about their crimes, it doesn't really feel as forced because that sort of camera work is common throughout not just this movie, but all movies. The reason this is a struggle for video games isn't just that the gamers have control over the camera in and of itself, like, to be clear. The problem is bigger than that. The movie director and the gamer have 2 fundamentally different incentives when it comes to how and why they use the camera the way they do. The director's objective is to tell a compelling narrative and construct a compelling mystery, whereas the player's objective is to solve the mystery. And when it comes to video games, the developer has to try and find ways to stop the player from ruining the experience for themselves without making it feel like you're a kid being forced to wear a life jacket at the beach. That dynamic will change what feels natural and normal, and in turn make it so much harder to choreograph anything. In fact, that's probably actually something to turn into its own little section here. Part 4. A Dancer's Nightmare. When it comes to a typical mystery narrative, every single character is part of the choreography. On some fundamental level, as the audience, we understand that every character, including protagonists and point of view characters, are intrinsically exclusively under the control of the narrative itself. They are part of a carefully choreographed dance together, where even their conflict is deliberately staged and shown as part of that performance. If you've ever watched a ballet performance like Swan Lake, you can see how important it is for everyone involved to be on the same page about what steps they're supposed to take in order to keep it all on track, even when that conflict is part of the process. Alternatively, you could look at fight scenes in action movies. Even though they're fighting, it still has to be carefully planned to look and feel right. It's not like in a video game where you can accidentally end up a bit too strong by the time it's time to fight a boss and just fucking obliterate them. Again, This is true of all narratives to some extent, but mysteries just take it a step further because the choreography needs to be actively telling a logistical story alongside the actual narrative taking place. Video game mysteries are, to continue the choreography analogy, like a nightmare where you've been dropped on stage in the middle of a choreographed performance where you don't know the choreo and are expected to keep it up and sort it out on the fly. You don't know the performance, you don't know the movements, you don't know who's going where or what they're doing, but the performance's quality hinges entirely on you being able to fake it as much as possible and avoid interrupting everyone else's flow. Typically, the way games get around this is by relying on you having some past experience with similar performances so you might know what to expect, as well as giving you maybe a dancing partner who can lead and whisper the next steps to you as you go, but that comes with its own complications as well. Nobody likes being yanked around on the dance floor and not knowing where they're going next, after all. The goal is to make it feel like the player's actions are part of the choreography, to incorporate your autonomy into the narrative. That's just really, really hard to do right, because autonomous players are hard to predict and build around even if they aren't idiots. If you want another analogy, sports games versus sports in other media are a good comparison to make here. Typically, if your movie or TV show features a sport, playing the sport will also be where at least some narrative plays out. However, it requires really, really tight choreography to line it all up and make it work properly, to get the close-ups of the characters or the touch-and-go moments that make the sport itself thrilling and allow it to contribute to the story, whether we're talking about Shane and Ilya in Heated Rivalry or Lightning McQueen in Cars. By contrast, in video games, it's nearly impossible to force those sorts of things without taking all control out of the player's hands and making it a cutscene. Tony Hawk's Underground has a story that involves skating, but usually in the form of characters doing a cutscene and then ending it by saying like, "Alright, prove to me that you're the best skater." And then the cutscene ends and you do a million 360s in the half pipe outside their apartment until they think you're sick as fuck. And then the story continues. And a lot of the time, it's because the people playing the game just, aren't actually that impressive at what they're doing. Both because the average gamer just isn't that good at stuff, and also that it just isn't that impressive to succeed in most games. A figure skating movie can have a climactic moment where the character performs a challenging move flawlessly, and that can be what it all builds up to. But a figure skating video game can't do the same thing without taking your autonomy away because it can't assume you can do the impressive trick if it is legitimately difficult. They can play it in a cutscene, or they might give you a painfully easy QTE, or they might make you just keep trying the jump until you get it right, but the more autonomy you give the player, the harder it'll be for them to play their role properly. The way sports games get around this is that they have the cutscene setting the stakes, then you'll go out and do a performance, and then if your performance gets enough points, then you'll win and the next cutscene will play out. The performance itself, though, won't really get to have any narrative beats directly incorporated because there's often just not a way to allow that to happen without fully putting you on rails, but provided the writing is decent enough, it can sometimes work out alright. Mysteries, however, can't take this sort of narrative shortcut because solving the mystery is what it's all about. By its very nature, the moment that a player expects to be allowed to take control and solve the case is the part that's most narratively important and hard to get right. The climax of the mystery is solving a mystery. Duh. Being able to point the finger and say, "It was you." If that moment's taken from you, you feel robbed. But also, if you get to that point and can't solve the mystery, you also just get frustrated. Earlier I made the comparison to the Polar Express moment where the train hits the lake and has to steer between the two bits of rail on either end, and that's basically what happens here too, except in the movie, there's no real risk of the train not landing. I mean, in universe, they don't necessarily know if it'll work, or the conductors do, but not the kids. But we as the audience know the movie doesn't have a branching narrative. It doesn't end at that point. It's a longer movie than that. There's not a way for the audience to fuck up and cause the train to not make it back on the rails. The only version of the narrative that not only exists but can exist is the one where it works, so you don't have to plan a contingency for what happens if it doesn't. To bring it back to the choreo analogy, another important aspect of this is that it depends on which role you're expected to fulfill in all of it. The easiest role is one like in Disco Elysium, where in terms of the murder itself, you start as functionally a background character who is stumbling around incompetently. A perfect pretense for the player getting their feet under them at the start of a new mystery game in a new universe where a whole bunch of new and confusing social, political, and cultural dynamics are at play that you're not familiar with. If you miss a step, no big deal, because at this point your bumbling around is part of your performance. However, as the narrative progresses, you start to figure out the choreography, you start to figure out your ones and twos, you start to figure out where everyone's supposed to be, and you become slowly more and more of a center stage character as you bring the performance home. The hardest role to write is something like Danganronpa, where you're right in the thick of it and are always the one who has to solve everything. Like, the evidence you collect is the only evidence that really matters. The accusations you make are the only accusations that really matter. You are center stage from the start, so everything you stumble on or get wrong functionally puts the performance on pause. Guess the wrong thing in a non-stop debate and the conversation comes to a grinding halt. And the characters have to be like, don't be silly, you know the real answer that'll progress this, right? And they start the conversation over again from the top. And on the flip side, you have games like Inescapable, where every mystery is entirely unsolvable by the player character because other characters hide crucial details from that you aren't allowed to figure out for yourself, which feels like you're being put in that center stage role, but also still just yanked around by the other performers. This is why, outside of literal children's media, this doesn't happen really in any other medium. Blue's Clues will incorporate the audience into the choreography, but only really superficially, like Janet Jackson bringing miscellaneous unks on stage to shoot poison. They're being incorporated into the choreography, but only in ways where their behavior is 100% predictable and where they don't have to worry about them disrupting things. Whenever Blue's Clues stops and asks the audience what the clue is, the audience is being given a big-ass blue pop print to identify and shout out to the screen, so the choreography can assume that you'll get it right. And if you don't, well, okay, the show's going to go on assuming that you got it right anyways, and nobody's going to be upset that the show didn't stop to correct you. When Zara Larsson or Lady Gaga bring someone on stage to dance with them, they and the other dancers will still do the correct choreo whether or not the audience member gets it right or knows it at all. So worst case, the performance continues basically as planned and it's just a goofy moment. In best case, the audience member nails the choreo and it's an iconic moment. Again, this is why it works best if your player character in a mystery video game is not essential to the overarching narrative progressing, at least at the start. It's one thing if Harry Dubois' fuck-ups interfere with his own investigation, but it's another if everyone has to keep repeating the same dozen lines of dialogue in a non-stop debate because Kaede can't figure out who's saying something that she can dispute. Where this analogy does kind of stumble itself is when it comes to the fact that you aren't the one actually doing the dance. You're in the shoes of another character, and just like every other genre in gaming, that makes it even more difficult. Part 5. Walk a mile in an idiot's shoes. Earlier we talked about how the audience's intelligence presents real challenges in video game mysteries, but the intelligence of the character you're playing as does too, and it cuts both ways. A very stupid protagonist will make it easier to justify exposition dumping to them or needing to hold their hand or reminding them of stuff, which does accommodate a stupid audience, but will also get frustrating for people who don't feel like they need to be handled with kids gloves. And that often does include the stupid people who do legitimately need them. A very smart protagonist can solve a lot of issues by thinking it through themselves, which can make it easier to solve a case, but which can also feel like it robs the player of agency. An average protagonist is theoretically what you're going for, but remember, the average is still going to be smarter than 50% of people, and also dumber than 50% of people. It can be a uniquely frustrating outcome where it splits the baby and leaves nobody happy because half the audience is trapped in the brain of someone who's solving mysteries before they have a chance to figure it out, while the other half is trapped in the brain of someone who takes too long to put things together. What's more, it's really hard to communicate that the protagonist is believably intelligent because, remember, they're the only character who doesn't know the choreo thanks to you. It's hard to believe you're the best dancer in the world when you can't hit your 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. And since players don't necessarily like taking responsibility for shit going wrong, they'll often act like the protagonist is the idiot. After all, the narrative needs to be written to accommodate that outcome too. It needs to be able to accommodate the characterization that you develop for the character, whether that means being hyper competent and always getting everything right, or being a complete fucking idiot who just brute forces everything. I actually think this is why a lot of Danganronpa protagonists are kind of perceived as idiots by the fanbase of those games. The protagonists are trying to play to where the writers think the audience is likely to be at with the given mystery. That's just hard. Like, there's often a lot of convoluted bullshit that it would be impossible to perfectly figure out the first time every time on a blind playthrough. But there's no way to guarantee where specifically the players will end up making the player character look stupid. Some games try their best to work around this. Zero Escape games typically build some degree of a failure state into the actual narrative. You aren't allowed to get the true ending without getting a lot of bad endings first, which makes it usually feel a lot less frustrating when you fuck it up in an escape room in Virtue's Last Reward. You're expected to struggle the first time, but also it probably won't be your last time in this room. And next time you'll be a lot better at it, and you'll be closer to solving the overall narrative mystery so it feels a little bit stronger. The narrative is built around the idea that, in universe for VLR, Sigma is failing repeatedly and learning from it. That kind of helps you feel less bad about failing, because you're also learning from it. The Somnium Files does something similar when it uses branching outcomes in a Somnium to further multiple narratives. However, it has to actually feel earned when this happens. Part of why Zero Time Dilemma and even Nirvana Initiative don't work as well as their predecessors for a lot of audience members is that the structure doesn't feel like it's actually pulling it off as well for a lot of reasons. Alternatively, you can go with a character who's either very dumb or very smart, but give them a reason for why the player is still able to take control of them in the way that does canonically make sense for them. Like, Makoto Naegi is objectively kind of a moron. Playing in his shoes can be pretty frustrating because he's famously just not very good at this stuff when it comes to his own intellect. However, the player is allowed to interject by finding evidence and connecting dots that Makoto probably wouldn't be able to figure out for himself, and the narrative excuses this by pointing to the fact that Makoto is the ultimate lucky student. He's why they can hold your hand so much, or why you can hold his hand so much, I guess. You are, in effect, part of his canonical luck. And while that's still sort of true for Goodbye Despair, in a way that's a lot more complicated, I think part of why it doesn't work out the same in Killing Harmony is that Shuichi's just supposed to be straightforwardly competent as the ultimate detective. Narratively, he should be able to figure this shit out, so it feels way more frustrating to have to hold his hand in the same way we held Makoto's and Hajime's. On the flip side, you have a character like Sarah Chidwin in Your Turn to Die, who is like objectively very smart and canonically extremely competent within the context of her narrative. She is literally the odds-on favorite to win the game for the host by a lot, and they explicitly go out of their way to describe how she did it when they ran simulations. However, the game then puts some clear limiters on her, most notably with some mental illness. For spoiler-related reasons, she has a mental breakdown after Chapter 1, and for the rest of the game, it often feels like the player takes the role of her sane consciousness fighting against her deteriorating mental state. The mysteries we solve are often mysteries that she is capable of solving herself under optimal conditions, but narratively, she has been very much so put into suboptimal conditions with the goal of making her less competent. So when we guide her decisions, we're effectively sorting her brain out for her. We're not just, erasing the fact that she's smart. Early in the game, Sarah hasn't yet emerged as a leader, so when she makes mistakes, the other characters largely treat her as just one of their peers who's also just unsure about what's going on. When she gets it right, it gives those characters the impression that she's figuring it out faster than them and establishes some of that leadership quality that'll be utilized going forward. When we get it wrong after she's got that leadership role, it's the mental illness guiding her down the wrong path. Her judgment is impaired. It's making her impulsive and making her make incorrect decisions that she and the other characters know she should be able to figure out, but she's just not in her right mind. And when we get it right, it's a triumph of Sarah against the conditions she's been put in. Harry Dubois in Disco Elysium is in the same boat, kinda. He is mentally shattered, literally into pieces of his psyche, and the game actively turns that damaged mental state into skills that you can try to fix and level up and then use in skill checks where you have to just roll the dice and pray Harry can figure it out. The voices in his head serve to guide the player, both in terms of directing them to the correct answer as well as just, making it feel more understandable when you get things wrong. After all, of course you'll do some stupid shit by mistake. This man's blood is basically pure vodka laced with liquid depression. It is not a reflection of your judgment or intellect if something goes wrong. Like, you should be, frankly, praised for keeping him alive. The man is a walking corpse. And when he gets it right against the odds, well, then we get to see the genius detective he once was shining through. The person that we hear about in these calls to other police departments or police officers who say, he was once this great detective, but he's fallen from grace. He's damaged, but there is a brilliant core under all the damage. And when we manage to get him to pull through, it feels like we're seeing this narrative of Harry picking himself up and putting himself together in a way that is really satisfying beyond just solving a mystery. And this is a strength of video games as a medium that can't really be pulled off if it's not interactive. When you roll the dice with Harry Dubois, it is a real gamble in a way that it never could be in a movie or TV show or novel because it's based not only on what you know and have learned, how you've built and equipped your character to try and meet the moment. A Your Turn to Die TV show probably just wouldn't be as satisfying because we aren't the ones getting to pull through with Sarah. We'd just be seeing her pull through by herself. Not gonna lie, it feels like so much of this video is focused on how video games are a bad match for the mystery genre, but it can't really go unremarked how that's just not the case. Mysteries, when done right, are truly one of the best genres in the medium. Mysteries in any medium are uniquely thrilling in a way that no other genre can be because of how they engage your brain and make you try and solve the puzzle and put the characters into these unique positions, and the interactivity of video games can really bring that to whole new levels when they get it right. And that actually brings me to another aspect of the medium worth considering here. Part 6. The Mechanics of Mysteries. In a typical mystery narrative, you kind of need to start with the logistics and facts of the mystery itself and then build a narrative around them in order to ensure that they're consistent and correct. But with video games, you can't follow the same process because you need to account for mechanics. You can't really decide what the mystery will be in terms of fine details until you determine the mechanics for solving it. And you can't really decide what the narrative will be until you determine what will work with the mechanics. But you can't really decide on the mechanics until you have an idea for both the mystery and the narrative so you know what'll work for what you're trying to do, which makes the whole process just so much more circular and complicated. For example, in Danganronpa, you solve cases by investigating and uncovering truth bullets, which you'll then use to disprove other characters' statements in the trials. If the game doesn't allow you to turn a piece of information into a truth bullet, then you can't use it, which means that the logistical structure of the mysteries has to be built around not only the choreography of the characters, but also determining which pieces of evidence are allowed to actually be used for anything, when they can be used, and what elements of the evidence are incorporated into the bullet. For example, if there was a truth bullet for the shirt on the beach that incorporates that the shirt is blue, then the truth bullet could be used to refute a statement that there was a red shirt on the beach. However, if the truth bullet doesn't acknowledge the color, or there's a different truth bullet for specifically the color, then that statement can't be refuted by that truth bullet about the shirt on the beach. Even if you know it's false, it still doesn't work for it. This allows you to create the conditions where theoretically, one truth bullet could be used to solve the case right out of the gate in theory. But since you're not given that truth bullet as an option, or you're not giving a corresponding piece of dialogue to shoot down with it, it just doesn't really matter. By establishing this structure, you create a hard line between things that don't matter and things that could matter. Not every truth bullet matters, it's not always useful, and sometimes they evolve over the course of an investigation or trial to become something useful, but there is still a line between unusable and usable. What's more, every single aspect of your narrative and logistical planning has to be built around these mechanics. Danganronpa breaks each chapter into 3 segments: Daily Life, Deadly Life, and Class Trial, and you can only distribute truth bullets to the player in the latter 2. However, so much of the setup for the murder happens in the Daily Life. Because it has to, because it transitions to Deadly Life as soon as the murder happens, but all of that lead up is Daily Life. So logistically, you need to find a way to introduce all those aspects of the narrative into the Deadly Life or Class Trial and bring them back so they can create a truth bullet out of them. What's more, you need to already have a complete idea of the murder mystery so you know what facts absolutely have to have a truth bullet associated with them. But that requires you to have also planned out the narrative in advance to decide who killed who, where they did it, what they did it with, how they did it, and why they did it. Danganronpa can't pull a Pretty Little Liars and change up the killer midway through the mystery because it's literally not equipped to do that. However, that also requires you to plan out the logistics of where every character will be positioned, what events are happening, and how evidence can be uncovered, which in turn requires tweaking the narrative to allow a character to explain why they're in a certain position or whatever. And this might sound obvious, but it's important to recognize how the mechanics dictate logistics and narrative in a video game in a way that a non-interactive medium wouldn't be affected. And it's kind of easiest to identify it when it comes to games that don't get it quite right. Master Detective Archives is a game that I did enjoy, but where it's really clear that they were trying to fit it into a Danganronpa-shaped hole that its narrative mechanics and logistics just weren't built to fit in. Disco Elysium's narrative works so well because not only are the logistics clearly pretty well planned, but also both of those aspects are built around the mechanics at the core of the game in terms of perspective, dialogue, and the RPG elements that define it. That's not to say that mechanics lock a game into a single path for everything else, though. Zero Escape and I, the Somnium Files are both built around an escape room mechanical structure, but they do it in very different ways logistically and narratively. Zero Escape games are very player versus environment. I mean, player versus zero, but zero is functionally the environment. Logistically, the challenge is finding a way to construct an escape room so that it can be logically solved, and narratively, the challenge is in finding a way to connect all these rooms and tie them into the bigger mystery. After all, within the context of each game, the structure they're trying to escape was devised with a single mastermind at the helm: Zero, Zero Jr., or Zero the Third. So, narratively, the rooms should all be connected in some overarching way, since they're all fundamentally connected back to that game's Zero. Contrast that with I, the Somnium Files, where the Somniums are bound by dream logic, and where you have to understand each individual character that you sync with in order to understand their Somnium. This change up to the logistics, making it so you need to understand the psyche of the individual character you're interacting with in order to work through the puzzle, also pretty dramatically affects the narrative. I, the Somnium Files is a very character-focused narrative because the mechanics and logistics demand it. Zero Escape games don't require you to understand how every given character thinks in order to solve an escape room because the rooms share a core creator bound by a shared reality, which changes how the story engages with the characters on an interpersonal level. Even though Zero is kind of present in all 3 games, like in the rooms with you, it's not the same as it is in I, the Somnium Files. What's more, the narrative structure of video games is often very weird compared to basically any other medium. Video games are way longer than movies and TV shows. We'll talk about that more in the next video. And similar to novels, they're meant to often be experienced in a way that involves less predictable start and stop points. With a movie, you're expected to watch the whole thing in one sitting, and same goes for any individual TV show episode. Video games, typically, are built for you to start and stop at pretty much any point you want, more similar to novels. However, video games often have fewer chapters or breakup points than a novel, especially, or at least relative to the amount of time they take, which is kind of weird for them. Like, Danganronpa games typically have 6 chapters each, ranging from about 4 to 8 hours long, which is, like, comically absurd for pretty much any other medium. Like, imagine a book you're reading that has 6 chapters but takes 40 hours to read. That would be a really weird way to break up your book. The closest we get are like TV miniseries or something where there's about, 6 episodes, but even then the episodes are never remotely as long as a video game chapter typically is. Part of the issue here is that video games don't really have as many clear, easy, short breakup points, especially as they get more and more open world or there's more expansive side quests to do. You know, Baldur's Gate 3 is a game where it'd be really hard to like break it up into a lot of small chapters. You have 3 acts, but I mean, where do you even draw the line between, one part of Act 1 versus the next? They kind of blend together in a way that they just don't in other media because necessarily they have to in order to keep engaging with those missions and quests and everything. And for mysteries, that just gets ramped up to 11. What's more, most mystery games use that spare time to build up secondary plot lines or an overarching plot that goes beyond the main narrative. There's a lot more room to develop side characters or establish ongoing side missions or whatever else, and unlike any other medium, there are optional narratives to engage with. Sometimes it's more subtle, like Danganronpa allowing you to become closer friends with one character or another in a way that, maybe affects your personal experience but doesn't really change the narrative. But in others like Disco Elysium, you can end up with these sprawling factional quests that can fill time and make your experience really unique. Some games keep it relatively linear, like Process of Elimination, where you're kept on rails a lot more, while others, like The 100 Line or Shoot in Order or Your Turn to Die, allow you to make decisions that fundamentally alter things like who's alive, who's suspicious, and even the basic themes and mechanics of the game itself. To bring it back to the core topic of the video, I think one of the biggest reasons we see mysteries struggling in this medium is that, unlike basically every other pre-established genre, mysteries require a total overhaul in how we think about their core structure. Obviously, every genre changes from medium to medium, that's not a hot take, but mysteries, given their unique reliance on logistical planning and non-interactive media, and the way that video games introduce mechanics in a way that fuck with that logistical planning, really can't rely on the conventions of their genre in another medium to help tell their stories in this one. Now, at this point, it's time for me to be honest with you. There is a solution to this mystery. At least, there's an answer for it in my mind. I've alluded to why I think video games struggle to get mysteries right throughout the video, but a lot of this has just been building up separate evidence points that still haven't really been connected. So, let's do that. Part 7. Solving the case. Throughout this video, I have presented 6 arguments for why video games struggle to get mysteries right. And while they might have seemed a bit haphazardly thrown together, I can assure you that they were not. If you paid attention, you might just have been able to piece together what I'm going to argue is the answer to all this. So, to recap, my 6 arguments were, in order, we're all kind of stupid, the first person liar, don't be suspicious or do, a dancer's nightmare, walk a mile in an idiot's shoes, and the mechanics of mysteries. In the first one, I argue that the act of giving the audience autonomy also requires accommodating the average person's intelligence, and that is a major obstacle when it comes to a genre where the audience's intelligence and problem-solving abilities directly play a role in their ability to understand and enjoy the story. In the second, I argue that playing a mystery game changes our relationship to the narrative when it comes to the concept of being lied to, a pretty fundamental part of a mystery narrative, and the unique challenges associated with making it an enjoyable experience to be lied to without making the audience feel frustrated or stupid. In the third, I argued that a uniquely difficult part of writing a mystery game is communicating suspicion to the audience, particularly in terms of dialogue and the little gestures and hints we would get in another medium but are missing in video games as a result of how the medium handles dialogue and giving the player autonomy. In the fourth, I argued that autonomy is also frustrating to us when it feels like we've been put into a carefully choreographed mystery narrative without being taught the choreo, and the balancing act that exists between preserving that autonomy enough to make the players feel like they have agency versus not allowing that autonomy to wreck the entire narrative by keeping the player character off of center stage, or providing characters who can help lead them when they don't know the steps yet. In the fifth, I argued that a big part of the challenge with mysteries, like all video games, is that we are technically autonomous to some extent, but we are not ourselves. We are almost always, at least to some extent, stepping into a different character's shoes and then trying to run around in them while their feet are still in there too, which just isn't really something we experience in non-interactive media. Finally, in the sixth, I argue that the mechanics involved in all of this fundamentally change how we go about planning and structuring a mystery because of how the unique logistical nature of mysteries as a genre get even more challenging when you have to account for how you expect the audience to navigate it, experience it, and eventually solve it. In all of these, there is one common thread that's always been emphasized, one common culprit who's guilty of putting this medium in such a uniquely complicated position when it comes to this genre. Who is it that's responsible for this? Who is the blackened of this case? Well, dear viewer, make sure to look close and I'll expose the ne'er-do-well in our midst. That's right, it's you! I really hope you're looking at your screen for that, and also that your screen is clean enough and reflective enough for you to be able to see yourself in it. In hindsight, this reveal might have needed some work. But anyways, yes, it's you. Or rather, all of us. We, the audience, are the problem here. We are too unpredictable in terms of our intelligence, our social proficiency, our interpersonal deduction, our ability to play our role, our ability to embody the protagonist we share shoes with, and our mechanical skill. A good mystery is inevitably one that filters for a relatively narrow audience. While many mysteries are very famous, very well known, and very beloved amongst their fans, they are necessarily also going to struggle with true mass appeal because it's impossible for a mystery to be able to accommodate the capacity of the entire general public, even before considering whether the segments of that public that are on the right level for the story are also interested in the themes it presents. Every other medium and genre requires its audience to be capable of understanding what it's trying to say via symbolism, subtextual inferences, and broader context. but no other combination of medium and genre puts such a hard limit on how much you can enjoy it if you cannot personally solve the mysteries and answer the questions and resolve the plot yourself. Then again, video games can get mysteries right. They can even turn mysteries into very popular games, especially if you start to ask, well, what all gets included as a mystery? We probably all agree that, like, Your Turn to Die counts as a mystery game, even if it's not as strict of a mystery. But is Persona? What part of Danganronpa counts as the mystery? Is it the overall narrative, the individual chapters, or both? Does Skyrim count as a mystery game because there are plenty of mysteries you can solve? Plenty of mysteries you can also create by being a thief or a murderer, I guess? Where does the 100-line Last Defense Academy fit into this, given that it definitely does have a lot of mysteries involved and is centered around solving them, but arguably isn't really framed as a mystery game, and it's possible to get to a lot of endings without resolving what the game presents as the core mystery from the start of the narrative? Does Process of Elimination count, even though it allows for virtually no autonomy outside of segments of the game that function more like strategy RPGs than any sort of puzzle-solving mystery? And what's more, audiences have proven themselves capable of achieving higher heights when presented with more ambitious projects. Like, it's not just that the audience is incapable of reaching that. Disco Elysium is ultimately a game that has some pretty academic themes for a medium that is so frequently reduced down to ball and gun. The 100 Line, if you include it in this discussion, has the kind of narrative complexity and divergent storytelling that you literally cannot find in any other medium because they aren't built to handle it, and its audience actively leans into the premise and engages with the complications eagerly. Children and adults alike end up enjoying games like Ace Attorney or Danganronpa, and in the real world, people also enjoy the escape rooms that share so much of their DNA with stuff like I, the Somnium Files or Zero Escape. It's not like people can't learn to love these games and up their competency with the involved skills to get better at them. Nobody's innately good at playing mystery games, and nobody's incapable of getting good at them either. So, who really is the culprit here? Well, plus side, it's not you. At least not really, probably. In reality, it's the industry of gaming. The problem isn't just that we're too dumb for mysteries or whatever, although the general public is not smart, that part is true. But it's that the nature of video game development and publication disincentivizes the production of the kinds of mystery games that can be great. The AAA space doesn't like making mysteries because they want to focus on genres with the biggest potential for mass appeal, and that itself is a result of games becoming bigger and more expensive to make over the years, which in turn necessitates focusing on the projects that have the biggest potential audience to recoup the costs associated with modeling realistic horse balls while also just making $1 billion for the CEO, which is of course the priority of all art making. However, mysteries are also just a lot rougher for the indie space to make than most other genres because they are so time-consuming to create in terms of that blend of logistics, mechanics, and narrative, and the scope of them can make them just really quickly unmanageable even when you do get on the right track. We'll almost certainly never see another game like the 100 Line Last Defense Academy again, and especially probably never see one that's like a specific mystery story, because that was an insane passion project by a group of even more insane creators who bet everything on it in a way that almost nobody else is willing or able to do. Video games are already a uniquely complicated medium because of the unique combination of arts and STEM involved in their production, and the challenges involved in having to work around the hardware of the audience in a way that no other medium really does, and the profit motive on top of all of it just makes it even messier. Hell, even when a mystery game does manage to pull it all off like Disco Elysium did, it did also lead to that studio imploding and everything falling apart for them, meaning that we will almost certainly never get to go back to Revachol for a second mystery. We will get 18 spin-offs or spiritual successors or whatever else because in the grand tradition of leftist infighting and fracturing, they have formed a billion different studios to try and make their own follow-ups, but we're never going back to Revachol as it is or was. Plus, it really needs to be acknowledged that while video games have it uniquely hard in a lot of ways as a medium when it comes to this genre, they aren't alone in it, both in terms of trying to create a good mystery and also just getting them made. There's a reason why we hold the great mystery writers in such a position of prominence in the literary canon, and it's because getting it right is truly fucking hard. Managing to stick the landing with a mystery in a way that genuinely satisfies the audience one time is a miracle. And as a writer, being able to consistently do it is a feat that only a handful of modern writers can stake a claim to. What's more, every medium is facing challenges when it comes to this sort of genre fiction. Movies and film in general as a medium have been in a weird spiral for a while now, where the kinds of self-contained one-off genre films that mysteries are well suited to have become less and less prevalent. Maybe it's because we're just dominated by remake cinematic universes and other genres that have more consistent mass appeal, or maybe it's just that people don't have a lot of faith in the film-going audience, or theater-going audience, whatever, to actually be able to understand mysteries, so they want to dumb it down for them. Maybe this is a chicken and the egg thing, who knows. TV as a medium is being actively destroyed by streaming, and the TV mystery genre is uniquely shitty when it's being streamed because it works best when everyone is able to discuss the mystery as it progresses together. Having a lot of individual episodes coming out once a week means that you actually put some pretty hard limits on how far anyone can get ahead of anyone else. What's more, this is going to sound mean, but it is true. TV writers are the worst across all forms of media when it comes to the specific issue of feeling the need to outsmart their audience and undermine their own narrative because they're worried that too many audience members have figured out the killer. The publishing world has been a nightmare for years, and now with AI bullshit flooding that fucking market, it's becoming impossible to stand out unless you get very lucky with book talk. And they tend to skew more romance than mystery anyways. Podcasting and radio have been taken over by true crime rather than fictional crime, exploiting real-life tragedies for content instead of engaging with fiction. Ultimately, though, it's not so much that video games struggle to get mysteries right. I mean, they do struggle a little bit, they do face a lot of hurdles, but they aren't insurmountable ones. And in fact, in a lot of ways, the medium does have some advantages, particularly in terms of it being a collaborative medium. There are a lot more people involved, and while sometimes that means there are too many cooks in the kitchen, it also means there are a lot more eyes on it who can keep an eye out for things that might not work, or might need to be corrected or fixed, or they might catch something that everyone else missed. They are still pretty achievable, though, with the right combination of people, resources, and time. The actual problem is that we live under an economic model that does a really bad job of allocating people, resources, and time. And what's more, the culture right now is pretty aggressively anti-intellectual and anti-arts, as demonstrated by that rise of generative AI. And unfortunately, there's not really a solution for that. There's no quick and easy, here's how to help get more mystery games made that I can give you to end all of this. And this sort of ending is what sucks about real-world mysteries. They often end pretty anticlimactically, with nobody getting taken away in handcuffs, or people getting to console themselves with the knowledge that justice will be served and things will be made right. We can buy these games when they do come out and support the developers and be vocal about our love for them, but realistically, I think we're going to continue to see this be a genre that the medium struggles to really fully embrace forever. And while that's a shame, maybe that's also a sign that we should appreciate the ones we do get a little more. Maybe instead of treating these icons of the medium as disposable content once their Game Awards season has passed or whatever, or their console generation has passed, we should do a better job of holding space for the legacy icons that paved new ground for the medium and achieved what seems impossible. The writers and the artists and the creatives and their brilliant works that have shown us that, in spite of all the obstacles we've talked about and so many more, it is still possible to captivate the hearts and minds of the people with a good whodunit. And that's where we're going to end this one. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more. And unlike normally, I actually have a bit of a schedule for the more that's coming up soon. Next up will be the January Members' Choice video, A Long Game Isn't Inherently a Good Game, which will be out on February 15th. Then after that, you'll be getting 2 videos in one weekend, with the first being the one you guys picked in the community vote back in November. The 100 line is my game of the year, but I can't tell you why, which will be out on February 28th. Followed by a bonus video accompanying it called How to Rig a Vote and Get Away with It. That'll be out on March 1st, so what the voting process is used for that community poll. Also, yeah, sorry, that was once again me lying to you guys to do a sort of study video, my bad. Lying in first person is too much fun, what can I say? The March 15th video will be the February Members' Choice video, we'll get to that one in a second. And then after that, it'll be the video that Kiri picked as a reward for being the top 2.0 Donathon donor. Why do games hate to tell you how to play them? That'll be coming out on March 29th. There's a lot of stuff planned, but I'm hoping to finally be able to actually stick to the schedule going forward instead of just saying I have a plan and then immediately falling off the rails like last year. Anyways, back to the Members' Choice topic. Each month, my channel members pay $5 or more a month to vote for a topic for an upcoming video, such as the one you just watched that they picked in December. If you'd like to support the channel and get a say in which of the videos in this month's poll get picked, you can become a member on YouTube or Patreon at the links in the description for $5 a month. The topics are Oblivion, Skyrim, and how limitations can make games better. This video would argue that Oblivion's relatively more restrictive gameplay and mechanics actually allow the player to make more choices and explore more freedom than Skyrim's open-ended approach to skills, combat, and progression. Why social skills actually matter in competitions. This video would explore how social skills work as both offensive and defensive tools in competitive environments, and why that's important. What does it mean to win? This video would be about exploring what winning actually means, not just in terms of how it affects us, but how we define win conditions and how hard it can be to get it right. How Sombra ruined Overwatch's story. This video would be about how my favorite character in Overwatch and my least favorite character in Inescapable is basically single-handedly responsible for Overwatch's narrative getting completely fucking derailed all the way back in 2016, why they've never been able to recover from her. Voting opened today and will run until midnight on February 10th, and as mentioned earlier, it'll be out on March 15th, so if you're a member, make sure to go vote, and if you're not, now's the time to become one. Lastly, thank you very much to all my channel members, including all current members plus all the members from when this video was chosen. At the $25 Elite membership tier, thank you to Adele, Robot Juice, and Bingo Banga. At the $10 Premium membership tier, thank you to Tortoise, Anja Tenar, Bailey Nichols, Cavi Corbin, Corey Anders, and NJD. At the $5 channel membership tier, thank you to Cage the Orc, Fish Toast, Alex Stone, Dexony, Cadence, March Alice, Gavos, Crimson Cyclo, Cat Lover 192, Corey, MV, The Only Enigma, Mariah, Meep Cube, Noisy Pitta, Harv, Marcy Gaskell, Deco _ Stefan, Lala the Bambi, Teo Tamara, Puddinces, Alinea, Caffeine Jelly, Ismi, Aiden S, 1000 Dumplings, Nilos, Prism, Lily Hero, Mitsucore, and Bubble Boy. Whether you're a channel member, a subscriber, or just somebody who decided to click on this video, thank you very much for watching, and I hope I'll see you around again soon.